Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be talking about the role of technology, especially in the role of technology in the context of a Cold War, which is so critical. My guest today is an expert on this topic. Mr. Ansgar Baums is a senior advisor to Sinolytics, and he consults corporations on geopolitical risk management. Mr. Baums held other positions within the corporate world, most recently as head of the Global Strategy Program at Hewlett-Packard and as head of Government Relations, Europe, Middle East, and Africa at HP. His most recent publication is Tech Cold War. Mr. Ansgar Baums, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you so much, Bill. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate you being with me today. Let's get right into it. What is the thrust of your new book? The topic is extremely important, very exciting, and one that we really need to learn more about.
Yes, sure. So yeah, the title gives it away, right? So we discuss in the book with my co-author, Nicholas Butts, how technology and geopolitics are linked to each other. It's a relationship that is now making headlines. As you can tell, every week there's a new piece out on export controls, on tech. You had the TikTok debate, you had the Huawei debate. So it's front and center, lots of attention on it. And yet the fundamental relationship between geopolitics and technology has long been neglected. And we are describing how this relationship has developed over the last 30 years. And how technology became center of geopolitics after being neglected for many decades as globalization was happening. Technology was globally available. It was considered not that important to international relations. And that, of course, has changed dramatically. And it led to a situation where, on the one side, policymakers are inventing new tools on how to basically use technology value chains to achieve geopolitical purposes. And on the other side, you had companies who entered this world completely unprepared, not being used to being subject of such controls and being, frankly, overwhelmed and without the right tool set to address these new challenges.
Yes, we're certainly seeing that every day. Before we go too far into it, I want to mention your website, www.techcoldwar.io, techcoldwar.io. So that gets that out there. You mentioned how rapidly this is moving. And of course, the two biggest players on the scene right now appear to be the U.S. and China. It seems to be that it's one day it's a frosty relationship, the next day it's a deep, cold relationship, the next day it thaws a little bit. How does this play out between the relationship vis-a-vis China and the United States?
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. In the end, I think these two players are the forces that structure the playing field, that are key and center if we think about where technology is going and how technology is actually developing in that new bipolar world. So just taking one step back, we come from an era where geopolitics was an afterthought, right? So after 1990, in the unipolar moment in global affairs, everybody thought that, from now on, it's globalization and liberal democracy everywhere. And the internet and digital technologies as we know it was basically developed in that era, right? So we assumed that technology is global by nature and is available everywhere. And I think the main fallacy here is that we mistook unipolarity for globalism. And now as this world is developing from a unipolar world into a bipolar world, we see a deep, deep impact of geopolitics on technology. And this is really the new dynamics that we see. And it will have fundamental impact on how technology will look like in the future, but also how corporations will operate in the future. So the times when enterprises were structured to be optimizers of globalism, this era is ending, and we see companies now adapting to the new realities, and basically companies deciding if they want to be part of both IT worlds that are developing, a Chinese IT stack and a Western IT stack, or if they really want to play only on one stack. And this is the most fundamental strategic questions that tech companies now have to answer.
Mm-hmm. And in any type of relationship, there's always the intended consequence and the unintended. What do you see as one or two of the intended as opposed to the unintended consequences of this frigid relationship, or perhaps a relationship that's more cooperative between China and the United States?
Mm-hmm. So I think it's fair to say that the whole exercise of trying to leverage tech value chains for geopolitical purposes is also for policymakers a rather new exercise. So what we've seen over the last decade was a lot of trial and error, right? So the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, and after it, the Biden administration tried and developed many policy tools. So starting with tariffs, of course, with Trump, but then quickly moving to issues like export controls on high-end semiconductors, or know your customer regulations for cloud services, or investment controls, or the ban on TikTok. And all these policy tools have never been really tried before. So there's a lot of, let's say, there's a steep learning curve here. And if I think about like for example, take the high-end semiconductor export controls, the intention was to slow the growth of China, right? So limiting access to high-end chips would trigger a slower technological development in China, hence giving the US an advantage. That was the original plan. What we've seen, though, is that these export controls basically helped China to develop a much stronger semiconductor ecosystem. Why? In the end, I would argue that innovation is basically a response to a necessity, right? And by creating a shortage on high-end semiconductors, we basically gave the Chinese ecosystem what it lacked before, which is this clear purpose and clear focus on what's important, and basically invigorated innovation in China in the high-end semiconductor world, also by being smarter, right? So what we saw with the now famous DeepSeek case is that DeepSeek was good in being more efficient than other large language models, triggered by the shortage of high-end semiconductor chips. So you can tell that innovation in technology develops not in a linear fashion. And I think that's one of the fundamental thought fallacies of these export controls, that technology is fluid and that a constraint, an artificial shortage, actually triggers innovation. So in that sense, I'd say the intention was slowing down China. What it really achieved was a less dependent China, and a China that's focusing on smart innovation to circumvent this shortage. And I think that's a fundamental problem that the US is now facing, and it probably has to calibrate its approach to these controls.
Well, we're going to come back and talk about the controls in just a moment. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a computer and you like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're talking about an extremely important area of technology, high technology, and it affects all of us, all 8.2 billion people around the world. But we're talking about it in the context of a Cold War, as opposed to perhaps a more cooperative environment. My guest today is an expert on this topic. Mr. Ansgar Baums is a senior advisor to Sinolytics, and he consults corporations on geopolitical risk management. His most recent book is Tech Cold War. Ansgar, this is such an important topic, and you're talking about so many of the controls that have been on, the export controls and those types of things. It seems that with a topic that's moving this fast, that the logical place to go is to get some type of international agreement, to get all the parties thinking the same way, to develop confidence building, those types of things. And in the past, we've traditionally looked to the United Nations to provide that. I know there are a lot of high-tech discussions at the UN. A lot of the CEOs of the companies you've worked for come to the United Nations almost every week to talk about these issues. What role can the UN play to help us better set the parameters, I guess, and define what exactly the conditions are and the rules and the regulations so that we don't have any mistakes? It seems to me we could have some really devastating mistakes, especially when it comes maybe to AI or to some of the other groups affected by it, like nuclear weapons or whatever. But what role can it play?
That's a very good question. So I'd say, I mean, the role of the United Nations in the first Cold War that we experienced after 1945 was rather limited, right? Simply because there was a great power competition ongoing, and the US and the USSR couldn't agree on much within the United Nations, right? So you know how many of the discussions and proposals resolutions were vetoed by one side or the other, simply reflecting a bipolar power competition in a contested world. And unfortunately, we are heading in this direction. And from a technological perspective, I would argue that the IT stack as we know it will no longer exist in the future. The IT stack so far has been globally accessible, right? So it was basically a layered cake of different technologies on top of each other. On the most fundamental level, semiconductors and compute architectures, and on the top level, applications that we use every day. And the technology was available everywhere, and it was more or less the same. I think this will change. We will see in the future two what we call hemispherical IT stacks, one dominated by the US and its big tech companies, and the other one dominated by Chinese tech companies. And both stacks will no longer be compatible with each other. So they will be built on different semiconductors and different compute architectures. They will be hosted on different cloud services, and they will provide different applications and services on top of each other. And that means that the idea that IT standards should be global is a little bit a thing of the past. So to give you one example, I do not think that the next generation of telecommunications networks will rest on the same standards. So 6G will be a very different thing in the Western world in comparison to China. Different standards, making basically giving you the experience that you might still remember. So in 2 and 3G, you couldn't use your mobile phone from Europe in the US, right? It simply wouldn't connect to the network. We had solved that problem with 4G and 5G, right? Today you can use a phone anywhere in the world. In the future, we might go back to the 3G experience, which is if you want to connect your American phone in China, it will not work. And since many devices are basically now IT centric, let's say cars are basically an IT stack on wheels, right? And they rely on connectivity for self-driving or for navigational services. If these services cannot connect to each other, basically you are looking at, your car will not operate, your American car will not operate in China and vice versa, because the IT in it is so different. And that's the future that we're heading to. So basically meaning IT is reflecting the geopolitical metastructure. And therefore, global governance bodies like the United Nations basically will play a lesser role than in the past, simply because, we will see these two stacks developing in different directions.
Very true. And you're quite right. During the Cold War, we fought the Cold War at the United Nations Security Council. The Soviet Union would veto our resolutions, we'd veto theirs, back and forth. And we see today that even though the UN was cooperating more so, that Ukraine has upended the whole situation. It's changed the dynamics. And we see that the Security Council now is semi-paralyzed, but luckily they're still part of the United Nations system, like the specialized agencies, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. You've got the the International Civil Aviation Organization. So those agencies still operate, and there is cooperation. But you're right; it'll have to be certainly changed to a large degree to get more of an involvement and of the particular parties. So that's extremely important. Well, it's one thing that's been speculated on, or maybe not speculated, maybe they know what they're talking about, is a lot of people are afraid that we'll have some type of a conflict between the US and China. How would this play into that? Some people believe that China could literally knock out our IT in this country, could knock out the eyes and the ears of our jets and our ships and that type of thing. What is the dynamic there, and how is that developing, and is that possible?
Mm-hmm. So I'm not a military expert, but what seems to be certain is that electronic warfare will be key and center in the next big conflict, right? As we've seen in the Ukraine, the fundamental problem of warfare, which Clausewitz famously described as the fog of war, that you do not really know what's going on once the battle has started. That is now changing rapidly with sensors, drones everywhere. So the picture of what's happening in the front line and what decisions do you take and where decisions are taking, the whole setup is changing rapidly. And if you want to blind your opponent, certainly electronic warfare is a centerpiece. So that's an ongoing arms race almost. And this is why, for example, the US was so keen to implement those chip controls by saying, these high-end semiconductors are key for the next military platforms that we are developing. If we restrict access here, we will have an advantage in a potential conflict, most likely over Taiwan. This is why it has become such a geopolitical issue, right? That's front and center. Having said this, usually there's more resilience in the system than you might think. So these IT systems, of course, are developed to provide backups and other let's say, redundancies in order to prevent disruption. But honestly, no one knows really how it will play out, simply because we haven't had a high stakes, full-on conflict on that scale that we might expect when two superpowers meet. So Ukraine has been, therefore, such an interesting, let's say, case for many military analysts to figure out how's the next war actually gonna play out, and no one's really sure. So there's a big question mark around this. Just one comment on what you mentioned before with the United Nations and the need to cooperate. So what I'm concerned about is that this tech Cold War is developing in a time when global cooperation is desperately needed, right? So literally the planet is burning. So we have to fight climate change, and that's a global issue. We have seen Corona as a global pandemic. So in the next pandemic, might be just around the corner. And these are issues that cannot be solved on one side or the other side of the Cold War. It requires cooperation. So we need to find a way in which, Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia, put it very well by saying we have basically three buckets. One is we need to manage our red lines. These are the issues that could lead to a hot conflict, like Taiwan. That's number one. Number two is we will have, of course, competition between the two superpowers in the economic sphere, in technology, et cetera, VP. That's the second bucket. But the third one is we need ways to cooperate regardless of this power competition. And if we do not find a way to structure international relations accordingly, we will basically run out of time to really manage climate change. And just to comparison to the original Cold War might help. At the height of the Cold War, the USSR and the US could still agree on a joint program to eradicate polio, right? So they agreed on a vaccine program, and it was rolled out, and it was a big success. And that was in the 60s. Compare that to what happened during Corona, right? We couldn't even agree on a joint vaccine strategy. Vaccines were basically weaponized in this global power conflict. So we cannot agree on anything right now, right? And that's a problem since we're running out of time. So if there's one thing I'm really concerned about, it's this lack of cooperation. And it has a very immediate relationship to tech. So if you think about the raw materials that we need to accelerate green technologies implementations, raw materials, batteries, right now we're in a situation where access to these raw materials necessary for the green transition might become subject to export controls and be drawn into this tech Cold War. And that means basically that green technologies will become more expensive. And this is the opposite of what we actually need, right? So to a certain degree, you could almost think along lines of, we probably need something like what I would call tech safe harbors, an agreement where we say certain technologies are too important for mankind, so they shall not become weaponized in this conflict. And that kind of agreement, that kind of accord, you could almost, we argue for basically a kind of a Helsinki 2 accord that we would need in order to somewhat manage this great power competition in a way that there is a space for cooperation and that there are certain technologies which will not be subject to controls.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree with everything you said for the last 2 minutes. You're absolutely on target. And that is an argument for more cooperation at the United Nations, because we cannot defeat these problems by ourselves. And of course, as I think it was Sir Winston Churchill said, it's better to jaw than war. And if you can bring these people together to talk through their problems, or at least talk about them, that's one step closer to not going to war than we were before. But you're absolutely right. We have to do this, and the UN is the obvious vehicle, since it's the only multilateral institution that brings together all of the countries of the world. Well, as you look at this is such an important topic, and it's such a complex topic. What recommendations would you make to the governments, to the private sector folks, to the United Nations, to anybody who has an interest in this, as far as what we need to do to develop our strategy for the future? And in our last minute or so, what would you recommend?
Okay, so I'm consulting companies, right? And if I talk to companies, I try to show them that geopolitics is here to stay. So companies need to adapt how they operate. Our companies that we see today are basically the survivors of a Darwinist competition in a globalized world, right? So they are great in leveraging globalization. They are great in optimizing their globally distributed value chains. And that has been a model of success in the past, but it will make you very vulnerable to geopolitical interferences in the future. And hence, corporations need to rethink how they operate, where they operate, how they produce their products, how they deliver their services. And that's a conversation that's impacting the whole corporate setup, right? From how to organize R&D, how to develop your IT infrastructure, etc. pp. And here it is important to develop very specific recommendations on how to actually buy, most bang for the buck, right? If you invest $1 in geopolitical resilience in a company, you want to make sure that this is done in an efficient way, because it's going to be costly, right? So that's something that companies need to learn to survive in this new world. That's number one. On the international level, as I said, I think we need more effort to distinguish these 3 buckets that Kevin Rudd has identified. And if I look, the last 10, 15 years, we spend a lot of time thinking about the middle part, the competition part, how to compete economically and technology-wise. That's all fine. But we need more effort to actually manage the red lines better. Taiwan is way too dangerous right now to the global economies, to stability, and with all the back and forth, with inflammatory signals from both sides, it doesn't really help. So we seriously need to focus on this, and we need to focus on the global cooperation piece. As I said, we cannot afford to let the focus on climate change being dominated by geopolitical considerations only. So there's one thing I think we should focus on. It's really this: we need bodies like the United Nations, maybe others, to somewhat organize a joint response to these global challenges, and that has been neglected over the last years. The problem that I see right now is that current trends in the US do not really lead to the conclusion that it will get better. So the Trump administration is not a fan of international cooperation and international bodies. So we probably are not really on the right track here. By the way, the Biden administration hasn't been great at this either, right? So with all the focus on this competition piece, we haven't seen much thinking around how to cooperate globally on these issues. So there's a lot to do.
There certainly is. And again, through all these problems, probably our number one issue is climate change. This is the one could actually destroy the planet, and it's moving in that direction. That's the sad part. But Ansgar Baums, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you so much for having me, and all the best.
My pleasure. Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.